Benko Gambit accepted. My opponent, 6 of those, had this situation as white. I had black pieces in all of them and wanted to see how these ideas, main ideas, the Benko that we have studied in the first video on the Benko Gambit, may work in practice. I'm gonna present only 3 games because the remaining 3 are not that good. My opponents actually just blundered some things in the opening phase, so they're not really significant from the perspective of opening theory and opening ideas. But these 3 are gonna be kind of interesting. Let's start and see how this first one went. So your opponent took on a6, which is the main move in the fully accepted Benko Gambit. And here, as we know, we're not gonna take the pawn on a6, but play g6. We're not taking the pawn on a6 because white gets a chance to develop this bishop quickly to b2 and oppose our idea of controlling this diagonal with our dark square bishop. Therefore, we first go with g6, and then we had knight c3, which is the main move. Now we take on a6, because this time b3 is not going to work well because the knight standing in front is going to be pinned once we move the knight away. So they're going to go with the knight f3 in this game, after which we just continue with bishop g7, and here we had e4. This may easily transpose into the main variation of the Benko. After bishop f1 they would take with the king, but in this game we had rook takes f1, which is a kind of a novelty, of course not that good one, because the king of white wants to hide here, not to stay in the center. There's not really much behind rook f1, and it's, we can say clearly, a bad idea. d6 obviously to prevent e4, e5, and then bishop g5. This is one of the most common ways of playing by these players that I met there in the Simul, below 2000 rating points. And if you're preparing as black against those opponents, I'd suggest you to see what to do in case the bishop develops to g5. You'll see, we'll discuss it, how it's not really meaningful that much, and plus it's abandoning the defense of the b2 pawn. I just castle here, queen c2. Guessing they're not gonna castle because they're just going to be crushed along this open files, but just developing a queen and controlling, defending the pawns, and the one on e4. Here is the first inaccuracy I made in the game, and I think I can say that I learned a lot after it. Placing the knight to d7. Almost like a thematic way of playing, or not knowing what's the best, and let's just develop the knight. That seems to be the most natural square, but it's not really good as one other move that I could play here. I think knight a6 would be a good idea. For example, in case of a3, we can still play knight before, but there is no point. I mean, they're not going to take this knight. Probably just going to move the queen away, and then we don't know what to do with the knight from b4, although we can stay there. I think better is c4. We can play the knight on c5, then ending up on b3, but much better, of course, is getting to d3, possibly checking white's king. Let's say they play something like knight a2 in order to attack the pawn on c4, which is knight c5, giving away the c4 pawn. If they take it, which is definitely not a good idea, we have rook a4 hitting the queen, and after that taking the pawn on e4 if we want to, but also there is just immediate knight f2 e4, just winning back the pawn. And look at this activity of black's pieces, everything is just perfect, and white's king standing in the center. Definitely horrible position for white. Instead we had knight bd7. The lesson here to learn is that you do not want to play automatically. A great example what I don't want to do. So bishop takes f6, trading the bishop like this for a knight for no reason or not being even asked to is always a strange idea. And here bishop takes f6. Another moment that is interesting here, when they took on f6, we do not need to just recapture with either knight or our bishop. Both of these moves are almost mathematical things to think about. Most of players would probably go with knight x f6 because this is kind of improving the position of the knight, although the knight from f6 is not really that much useful anyway. Other players would say, well, because the knight is not usable there, I'm gonna take with the bishop, which is exactly what I did and why I did it. But there is this e takes f6, a surprisingly interesting move. Most of the professional players even would not even consider this because it's just blocking the bishop, and whenever we play f5 they just take it. We get really a terrible pawn structure. This is what happens in the first level of thinking. But then you can think of this the other little bit different way. You play e takes f, but look at the king of white. It's on the open file. You put the rook on e8 and there is pressure. You're not just gonna be blindly hoping that you're gonna win the pawn on e4 because the king is behind. You're gonna move the king away probably. But the thing with the f5 pawn is that you do not recapture it. You just play f5, they capture it. Let me show you that. So king e2, f5. I mean, king e2 is because they want to connect the rooks, they need to do something to castle maybe by hand. This thing that they did in the opening phase, now they're trying to fix, but it takes time. Meanwhile, we're opening the game as soon as possible, which is with f5, and after e takes f, rook e8 check, king goes to d1, let's say, and now we are ignoring the pawn on f5. They take, just take g6, everything is fine. We're okay with sacrificing this pawn for the sake of opening the file and getting the pieces very active and, of course, harassing white's king. This is something overlooked really often. When they capture, we do not need to recapture it. Okay, that was with e takes f6, but instead we had bishop takes f6, so we're keeping this typical Benko structure. Knight e2. This is again Benoni idea, getting knight to c4, not bad one. And I went for knight b6, which is apparently not the best here. I wanted to prevent knight c4 and possibly end up on a4 after queen d7. An idea of trading the whatever we have for the knight on c3 to open this diagonal here and inflict further pressure on b2. But white can often play just b3, preventing our knight a4, and you know, that was maybe not the best. Possibly better than knight b6 was queen b6, with the idea of after knight c4 just placing the queen on b4, hitting this to putting pressure there, bringing the other rook to b8 after, and the game is definitely very good for black. Plus, I mean, not to mention the white's king's position, just terrible. So we had knight b6 instead, and then f4, and this is what you may be seeing often, and I saw that in this Simul. Plenty of players, like most of them, would just start pushing this pawns on the king's side, doing this kind of thing, which is quite strange to me. But this is now the thing that we can learn from. If f4 happens, what you're supposed to do, especially when the white's king standing in the center, but also when it's on g2, like after g3 and having the king there, is that we want to expose their king. And what's there to do? Well, break in the center. The king is in the center, well, let's open the files against it. e6, of course, in case of d takes c, f takes c, and then d5, this is the plan. We do not care now about this white's queenside pawns, but we are pushing through the center, we are opening files against this king. Surprisingly, white went for f5, which is really not something expected, because their house is burning, this all in flames, and they're just pushing the pawn on the f5. E takes d. Now, of course, if e takes d, the king's going to get checked and position is lost. But anyway, they castled long, and of course that means that this rook is going to be winning the pawn on a2 at some point, and the other rook is coming to b8. But at this point we have this central pawn, so why not to go with d4? Knight d5, we can take on a2. This is already like completely winning position, and I don't think we need to go further into this. Okay, moving on to the next game, that's this one, where we had b takes a6, again, g6 of course, knight c3, bishop takes a6, and here we had e4, the main variation of the fully accepted Benko Gambit. But again, you see bishop g5, so if you're preparing for your opponents that are about lower than 2080 points, then you can probably be expecting this bishop g5. Okay, let's see how to face it. Bishop g7, knight f3, castling, just normal moves for the time being, g3, and now knight bd7. In this moment, there is no point of going knight a6, knight b4, there is no queen on c2, there is just a3 if you would go to a6. I mean, they can prevent us from coming to b4 this time, because the queen and the rook are connected. Although still we can go to c7 and then eventually try to trade for the knight on c3. It's not terrible, it's just there is no reason to do anything special. At this point, knight d7 is also good. We may be going with this trade of the knights, and we are doing well. King g2, and then we had queen b6. This is one of the ways, queen a5 is the other. There is also rook a6. There are plenty of ways here how to create setup of these heavy pieces of black. Rook a6, as I said, queen a8, rook b8, this is one. There's also queen a5, rook fb8, only 2 moves spent. But in this game I preferred queen b6 because I'm hitting b2 pawn. And we had b3 here. I was expecting this move queen e2, defending the pawn on b2, so that after rook fb8, they play, let's say, b3. Now we play queen a6, trying to trade the queens and get into something like this. Hitting the knight with the bishop, threatening to take it, and then take on a2. If they do h3, we just do anyway, bishop takes c3, and after rook takes c3, just going back with the knight, hitting this pawn, and this one is also hanging, and black is doing really well. Let's go back. After b3, another automatically done move is rook fb8, which I'm not proud of, because, I mean, what are we doing on the b file at all? It's a better place than f8, obviously, but if someone would be asking me why did I do that, I'd say probably that I didn't find anything better. What we have seen in the first video on Benko is that if this knight cannot go to a4, and the other one is not able to come to b5, there is this another way of solving the problems of inactive knights and opening this diagonal here by going with a knight to g4. Here that move would be working perfectly fine. And another interesting thing that can happen after knight g4, and this is one of the thematic things in the Benko, may happen in case of, let's say, queen c2 for white, defending the knight on c3. Now that move that is really interesting, and it works even better when the queen's standing on b7. You'll see why, but I'm gonna now immediately just show it. It's f5. Since the knight is on g4, you see there is potential coordinated attack on f2, plus the queen is also there to attack f2. Do not forget about this kind of strike. I'm gonna just demonstrate how powerful it can be. For example, If white takes on e7, we just take on c3. That's surprising. And after queen takes c3, f takes c4. And if we lose this exchange, that's fine, because we're going to be taking the f2 after knight g5. And after king h3, just look at this domination of knight d to e5. The knight's being defended on g4, the rook is dominating on the second rank, the king of white is going into some kind of journey there on h3. It's a beautiful situation. But for you, it's important just to notice this f5. That move combined with the situation of white's king without the light square bishop, with the weakened f2, with the weakened light squares, it may be a very interesting solution for so many positions. We had rook fb8, automatically done move, and after knight e2, queen b4, okay, hitting the knight on c3. Here we had a huge mistake by the opponent playing f3, after which they just lost their knight on c3. Sadly, this game is not that much challenging, and I put it here because of this little moments in the opening phase that were of some significance. You could learn how, again, some automatically done moves like rook fb8 shouldn't be done. This is the typical setup for your rooks, but still you need a good reason to place them that way. There is maybe a better mission for this f8 rook than placing it to b8. As we could see, sometimes there is f5. Okay, moving to the third game, the same thing, b takes a6, g6, knight c3, bishop takes a6, and then e4, of course, the main line with g3, king g2, and here we had a little bit different approach by white, pawn to f3. I thought at first that there is no point of f3 since, they're taking away the place for the knight from g1, and there is no point of defending the pawn on e4 since it's not even under attack. But there is one good thing behind f3, and that's they're covering g4, so we cannot really hope for knight g4, knight e5. And the second thing that I discovered only later is that the knight from e2 is going to be actually quite useful here because it's going to reinforce the knight on c3 once black manages to, let's say, trade one of the knights for that one on c3. We had knight bd7, which already is not maybe the best, because an alternative may be the other little bit different setup. Knight fd7 after knight g2, we can go knight a6. This is maybe something we can get. Placing knights on one of the knights to d3, maybe again supported by c4. That was an alternative. But okay, let's go with knight bd7. It's not a mistake. Knight g2 and then rook a6. This one is not that much of automatically done because black is thinking of placing the heavy pieces the way that is kind of a standard, but also you can see that this white's king being weakened with f3, black wants to exploit by having the queen on a8. On the other side, since white has f3, it's maybe even saving a little bit white's kings, keeping it a little bit away from the black's queen on a8, because often when the pawn is on f2, something happens on that diagonal, the king is suffering. Now, since white has f3, maybe this is not the best because the white's king is secured by the pawn on f3. Queen c2 was done by white, but I would like to show you what white could do actually here, exploiting the slowness of black's setup and the powerful plan of white, which again we have seen I think in the first video on Benko, but here it's possible to reach that ideal setup of white. Starting with a4, let's say we go queen b6, then knight b5, and after rook f to a8, which is again a really naturally looking move, knight e to c3, and after this, which is the best setup for the knights, they just need one more move or two more moves. With the rook, first of all, to move it away from the a1, push b3. After b3, white secures well this a and b files. There is no way that we can actually do like normally what we can do on those files in the Benko. This time with this blockade and solidified pawn on a4, while b3 is being blocked by the knight on b5, white is doing really well, possibly even slightly better. But we had instead queen c2, not a4, and then queen a8. This whole plan of black may even work. Here, another player played rook d1, aiming to stop black from doing a certain operation in the center. However, bishop f4 is also like kind of anticipating a certain action of black in the center. And if you see the queen on a8, it means that the queen is eyeing the white's king. Black is intending to break the pawn structure of white. And that means with a move like e6 eventually. However, here I decided to go for queen b7. I don't know why e6 was not done. I cannot justify this move. Should be embarrassing a little. Rook a b1 played, going away from this diagonal, possibly moving the pawn to b4 event at some point. Rook f to a8, thinking that this pawn may be vulnerable at some point. h4. Normally, I'm really happy seeing this played by my opponents, because I don't really think that they have enough to generate a serious attack on the king side. So I'm welcoming this h4. I'm seeing that as not only a wasted move, but also as a weakening of their king's position, which is not fully correct. Sometimes they can really develop something on the h file, and I think here, since the rook is still playing on h1, I think it's meaningful. Plus, I cannot see how black can exploit this right now. But obviously, when the attack starts on the flank, especially on the king side, what we are looking for is a counter through the center, and that of course comes with e6. One of the typical ideas of black in the Benko, especially when the king is without the light square bishop in front. You see, with a little bit advanced pawns, and we are thinking, you know, if we expose a little bit or open through the center, the king of white is going to be in danger. And exactly that happened. After d takes c, which maybe was not the best, f takes c, black is kind of not really interested that much anymore on the queen side to attack, but to generate pressure through the center. Since black has a greater number of pawns in the center, they may even push there and secure activity of their pieces behind those pawns. For example, in case of a4, we just go with d5. Let's see that. d5, e takes d, e takes d. Let's say b3, d4. The knight is under attack. It moves away. Then we go knight e5, centralizing. We have more space through the center, which is the most important part of the board, and black has compensation at least for the sacrifice pawn in the opening. However, we had the rook edge to d1 instead, hitting the pawn on d6, inviting of course d5, which happened here. After d takes d takes d, and now b3. White is trying to secure a4 and then knight b5. This again the same ideal setup in the Benko. I really want to underline that this game clearly shows general idea of white in the Benko to secure the queen side. Fortunately for black, unfortunately for white, we can see that here black is generating the counter through the center, which is the right reaction, especially after h4. We had king h8, which is a symptom of laziness, like lazy to think of what's going to happen if we keep the king on g8, placed on h8, and you just say, okay, my king is definitely safer. I will continue thinking after my opponent plays their next move. That's the sign of laziness. Black could conduct the attack without moving the king to h8. This is a sign of irresponsible play. I cannot find a good word to describe how embarrassing these kind of moves are. This move is just avoiding calculation, involving yourself deeper into the position. A better move here was d4. Just, it's logical. Why not d4? Because attacking the knight goes to the side. What I missed here is to calculate the consequence of knight e4, because they're attacking c5, and normally you would be thinking, well, let me just defend this pawn. But that's already like not a good sign. We need to defend, we're reactive. You see, knight e5 is a good move because knight takes c5 is a huge mistake. We take, and after queen takes, we have just a move that drops the queen and wins the game immediately, which is rook c8. Look at that. The queen is dead. That's clearly showing that black was not ready to calculate. Black was not involved enough in the game. So, okay, we had king h8 and a4. A very good move because this time after d4, the knight is coming to b5, after which they are threatening this kind of things. Well, you see, that was allowed by black playing king h8. Now black needs to reorganize a little. Are we going to go with d4? Is it still good? Knight b5, do we have something? Well, again, black was lazy. I was lazy, actually, to think of the consequences of this move d4, knight b5. The truth is, after knight d5, which is of course a logical continuation after moving the pawn away from d5 to d4, you may overlook that there is knight e6, but then again knight e6 may be met by knight f4 check, and after knight takes we just collect the knight, so that's not going to work for them. And if they go back with the bishop to d2, for example, now we can reorganize the rooks because they're not doing anything on the a file. We just go with the rook e6 to rook e8 and then hitting d2, and obviously black is much better here. I was lazy. I couldn't really calculate, I guess, d4 and what's happening after. Played rook e8 immediately. This is safer. You're not inviting knight to b5 into your camp. That's how amateurs play. Rook e8, and then let's see what's going to happen. Luckily for me, my opponent blundered, played a bad move. G4. What is this move doing? The king is anyway bad. Now it's just going to be easier for black to maybe think of some sacrifices. d4, hitting the king, hitting the knight. Tactical possibilities are there, and there is no improvement of the white's pieces with this g4, just weakening the king. Okay, let's go with g4 and then rook e6. Fully intuitive way of playing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have good intuition, but a sign of involvedness into the game is when you calculate and you actually conclude that you could play something more concrete. With d4, you're basically asking white's knight to come into your camp, and then you either have something or you're going to be starting to defend. Knight c7 is about to happen. If you calculate further, you may see that knight g4, or also knight d5, I guess, But knight g4 may be good because, I mean, the pawn is pinned, so there is no f takes g. So that after knight c7 we can play knight e3, which is not difficult to calculate because this time the bishop needs to take, otherwise queen is lost. And after rook takes c3, you can see that the knight cannot take on a6 since we have queen f3 and it's game over. So this is not a long line. For a FIDE master, this should be a piece of cake. But you see, I actually was again lazy and I thought, well, let's just improve. And whatever happens now, I'm gonna just push probably d4. Rook d2 happened and then d4. The game is now completely winning. After knight b5, knight e5, the knight is improving. Everything is now getting better. And here we had a bad decision by white. We had rook bd1, which is another blunder. And if you want, you can guess the move. It's not that difficult. There is a rook takes c2, obviously, and after rook takes c2, you can take again. And after queen takes, there is this fork with the knight f4. Thank you for watching, and if you want this video to be seen by a greater number of people, hit the like button, leave the comment if you want to. You can also leave your game, Benko Gambit, and yeah, then see you in the next video.